often policies and practices are adopted by organisations, not because they're effective, but because they're legitimate. We call this institutional isomorphism. It relates the tendency of organisations within similar fields to imitate each other in pursuit of legitimacy, and often in the context of uncertainty around what on earth to do. I think that we see something similar about what has become legitimate to say and to talk about, that clash or that potential clash between gender and trans rights. The debate has become so heightened and so sensitive that pushes a particular way of framing that particular discourse, which I think is quite problematic, because I don't think we should ever be stifling debate. I think we should have open conversations where we disagree, but we can come to some kind of debate or conversation about this point.
It does seem to me that the possibility of radical change is something which might be both an opportunity, but I would also say a risk. I am a bit worried that the next phase in politics, particularly in the UK, might be a little bit more of the same. I don't think the pace of change will be sufficient enough for some people. And the downside to that is sometimes a radical solution can emerge, which is much, much worse than the one we've got.
I would absolutely agree that I think it is a really dangerous, potentially, situation. But I also think that there's a prevailing view that some people are poor and some people are rich. But I would argue that some people are poor because some people are rich. Some people get rich because other people are poor. And we need to understand the relativity of that. And I think a kind of better understanding of our shared interests in that way would help us to have a different conversation around this. But I have to admit, I don't feel enormously optimistic about that at this very moment.
Let's just touch on this point of rational discourse, because in any disagreement, any conflict, the way you reach compromises is through talking to the other side. It's through talking to the people who disagree with you and trying to find points of agreement. And where there is no agreement, negotiating. And when that process fails, what you're left with is war. And it seems to me that it's the fact these sort of debates have become so toxic and so weaponized. And if we think about this within the legal profession, I think Alison Bailey's case, again, it just shows that if this conflict is not addressed calmly, then the war of litigation is what follows. I just wondered, just on this issue of rational discourse, I'm a business owner, I'm a lawyer, I'm a father, I'm a friend, and I just wish everyone the best. And I want to facilitate, insofar as I am able, for everyone to achieve their full potential. And because we aren't a huge employer, I mean, we've got 100 staff, so we're not insubstantial either. But because we have a relatively small team, we're able to do that on quite a sophisticated basis. So if someone is from a particular background and requires certain support, we don't really do that through implementation of policy. We do it through discussion. We do it through individual meetings. We do it through consensus. We do it through monitoring next steps. To be fair to the larger corporate law firms, again, as an eternal optimist, I think the vast majority of people leading those firms around partnership tables or senior partners, I think they will want the best for their staff and their friends and their neighbours as well. But the difference there is they're trying to apply that fairness at scale. You know, thousands of staff, hundreds of partners, multiple locations. Is there an issue there, do you think, that the bigger law firms are at a disadvantage when trying to just apply that general fairness that I think drives most of us?
I think you're right. And this is a huge conversation. It's a fascinating conversation. But one of the kind of issues here is we talk about fairness, but not everybody agrees what that means. We will all have different definitions of what equality means, of what fairness means. Those definitions will depend in part on our politics, what our underlying sense of politics is. Now, this is interesting because one of the things that's happened in equality debates, and particularly in D&I, is it's become depoliticised. One of the reasons why D&I has been seen as quite palatable to so-called elites, organisational leaders, whatever, is precisely because it has been depoliticised, in theory at least. So it gives the impression that you can talk about these issues as though they are not political. Now, in practice, that's impossible because we are talking about equality, and equality is in its very essence about politics. It's about power. Who has it? Who's prepared to share it? Therefore, it is fundamentally political. If we pretend that it's not, the people who tend to benefit are the people who already have most power, because by obscuring that, you obscure the underlying systems and structures that give them that power. So the first thing I think we need to do is acknowledge that and sort of bring politics with a small p, not a capital P, back into the debate and acknowledge that this is a political issue where there will be conflicting interests. Because one of the other things that D&I has done is tend to suggest that we all share the same interests, which is probably maximising productivity and performance. And therefore, once we understand that, there are no conflicts in the employment relationship or anywhere else. Now, that's probably fundamentally untrue because there will always be conflicts in that relationship. So I think there's a lot of sort of more than one elephant in the room, so a way of putting it, that we need to kind of bring back into the conversation. But I would also say that we are all, at this point in history, operating in an extremely complex environment. Organisations particularly are subject to many competing demands from very many different stakeholders. And there's an argument, a very kind of famous academic has talked about organisational hypocrisy and has argued that in those circumstances, and again, I'm simplifying this and probably getting it a bit wrong, but in those circumstances, organisations and leaders will be hypocritical because they have to be, because in our modern world, the only way that you can function sometimes is to be a little bit hypocritical, to stand up, to talk about higher values than you can actually enact a lot of the time. I think we need to be more open and transparent about that and to get those hypocrisies out on the table, to discuss them, to discuss the tensions, to open up about the conflicts, because I actually think that's a more productive way of moving forward than pretending that they don't exist. So I think that was a really roundabout way of answering your question, but hopefully it covered it in some sense.
No, it wasn't roundabout at all. I thought it was excellent. Yeah, I mean, let's just, before we move on, because I must let you go shortly, and I just want to wrap up on where do we go from here in terms of potential change. But I do just want to underline this point. I love talking. I love listening. I love being persuaded that I'm wrong. I love persuading other people that they are wrong. I love finding consensus. And most people I meet do. It's what we do in daily life, in business. And I think we all, as a legal profession, as a business community, and as societies, need to re-embrace this issue of conversation, discussion, and compromise, and not give up on finding the right compromises through continuing to discuss. And I mean, I have certain views on this or on some of the issues we've touched upon, but I'm very capable of being persuaded that I'm wrong. And I think to some extent the growth of the podcast and the longer form podcasts such as this has been a real positive in that we can take these time to unpack these issues, do a little bit of a deeper dive. And if that's the function of this new form of media in podcasting, then it makes me very happy indeed. But I must move on because I know we need to let you go. Let's just move on to where we go from here. And I was very interested in that point you made earlier, Louise, about the solution to some of these issues, to this data which you've identified in your book, could be that we change the dial between seeking equality of opportunity and seeing equality of outcome. I guess just to close, what are the differences between those two, and in what way could equality of outcome be achieved?
Oh gosh, that's another
podcast, isn't it?
So yes, I think it is. I think it is. So equality of opportunity is associated with sort of with meritocracy in particular. It's the idea that that opportunity should be available to the people who work hardest and have the most talent, and therefore they should be able to kind of get to the top. And they're being very, very, again, simplifying here. Equal opportunity is very closely associated with things like social mobility, actually, which is a really important policy agenda at the moment. One of the critiques, again, that people like me might have on it is going back to what we said earlier, that actually that vision of meritocracy can never be realised. It's just impossible because there is no objective way we can measure these kind of outcomes. Even if we could, should we necessarily reward people who happen to be born with more talent in a particular that suits a particular kind of historical context? Is that necessarily fair in and of itself? But also, the idea of equal opportunity is seen as a way to produce a particular version of fairness or equality. But people like me would argue that actually it's a way to justify inequalities. So if you can convince sufficient people that their opportunities are solely based on their talent and hard work, it doesn't matter how unequal society becomes in terms of things like income and wealth, because you can argue that those inequalities are justified, they're fair, going back to the conversation we had earlier about merit. And therefore, it's a way to sort of legitimate unfair systems, if you like, if you convince that that system is in place. It's based politically on the right, essentially. Equality of outcome suggests that actually, for a variety of reasons, that model doesn't work, and therefore we should share rewards more equally across society. So it's a kind of model of redistribution. It doesn't mean that there won't be differences in society, but it's a way of sharing rewards, both material and symbolic, more equally across society and within organisations as a whole. I don't mind admitting that politically I lean left, and my preference is towards equality of opportunity. And I think that there's lots of kind of selfish and non-self reasons to believe that is a better system, one of which, and I'll just give one example, is that equality of opportunity is very associated with a sort of very turbo-driven sort of capitalism, a very individualistic society, highly competitive. We're all scrabbling to get to the very top to get those relatively scarce rewards for ourselves. I actually don't think that makes for a particularly happy or contented or harmonious society. I think it undermines social cohesion in the end. And I think it's damaging, in a sense, to all of us. So for me, that's a good reason. I think we are all, in terms of well-being, better off if we have a little bit more equality of outcome. So that happens to be my preference. I think that we can take that down to the organisational level as well. So in terms of understanding what works, what really works in terms of diversity inclusion, what really makes organisations more inclusive, the best studies on this have found that you do things like you democratise your organisation, you reduce hierarchy, you share power, you make those big changes within organisations. It's not a panacea, nothing is, but it can lead to more diversity and inclusion, particularly the latter. Not many organisations can or want to do that at the moment, I would say. Often when you talk about the kind of more radical solutions, by radical I don't mean extreme, I mean those are the root causes of inequalities, they can sound extraordinary, because we have been seeped in what I would call neoliberal discourses within this country for so long that a genuine alternative often seems almost ridiculous, because we've been so trained to think of in a particular way of how things should be. So my kind of tiny mission, again, not to make myself sound too self-important, is to try and encourage a different conversation, to think about ideas that seem completely ridiculous at this point and try to normalize them a bit, try to make them part of our conversation, to make them seem more realistic, because I think those are the things that will drive genuine change.
Well, it's an interesting point to end, and you've articulated that so well. I mean, let me just give you my position on that before we do wrap up. I'm not particularly a political person. I guess you'd say, libertarian. I want people to be able to do largely what they want as long as they don't hurt anybody else. But to me, there is a balance here. I personally think that equality of opportunity is something we should always strive for. I think under the current system, and I'll move to your suggestion that we need to have a rethink on the current system, but under the current system, I wonder whether equality of opportunity will ever be achievable. Because just to use my own example, I was born with lots of privileges that I talked through earlier on. But was I in the same position? Did I have the same equality of opportunity as someone who was white, male, but happened to be from a very wealthy background and had public school and went to that sort of thing. Well, it could be argued that I didn't. It could be argued perhaps that my resilience and my background was something that was nurtured due to the fact I wasn't from that. But one thing I think, which is a simple fact, is that the inequality between the haves and the have-nots, not just in the UK, but I think across the world, in terms of more billionaires than ever, and poverty seemingly seeping wider and wider into society, a working poor is a phrase that's often used. It does seem to me that the possibility of radical change is something which might be both an opportunity, but I would also say a risk, because clearly, I think most people would say if we can level up those respective positions of the haves and the have-nots, that would be of wider societal benefit. And if that was through some sort of radical political or systematic change, well, that could be an opportunity. But I am a bit worried that the next phase in politics, particularly in the UK, might be a little bit more of the same. If we change governments, maybe there will be some movement left or some movement to different principles. But even if there is, I don't think the pace of change will be sufficient enough for some people. And the downside to that is sometimes a radical solution can emerge, which is much, much worse than the one we've got. And I'm worried about that. So to wrap up, maybe just to get your views on that slightly doomsday scenario.
Yeah, gosh. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I worry about that too, because it's almost like at the moment, I would say that I don't think we are being offered a true alternative. I think when that happens, it's a vacuum into which quite dangerous forms of power can take up that vacuum and lead to outcomes that we wouldn't necessarily want. So that really worries me. But what I would also say is it goes back a little bit to what I was saying, and the way that the conversation around this about what's possible to say and how it's possible to think has become incredibly narrow over the last 20, 30 years. That's partly because of the media that we have in this country, around the way in which that conversation is controlled. And it's really problematic because I would say it makes politicians who are notionally on the left incredibly timid about stating a true alternative in case it loses them votes. And there's recent history that leads into that situation. But I would absolutely agree that I think it is a really dangerous, potentially, situation. But I also think that this sounds, how do I put this? It doesn't sound kind of patronising. I don't mean it in that sense. I think we need to understand inequality a little bit better, because I think there's a prevailing view that some people are poor and some people are rich. But I would argue that some people are poor because some people are rich. So some people get rich because other people are poor. And we need to understand the relativity of that we're all in these kind of social relations together. We're not isolated islands who are kind of not affecting other people and vice versa. And I think a kind of better understanding of our shared interests in that way would help us to have a different conversation around this. But I have to admit, I don't feel enormously optimistic about that at this very moment.
Let me just speak up, if I may, for the perhaps some of the partners at those large corporate law firms. I mean, mates of mine who I went to uni with of our corporate law partners, not just in London but outside as well. Some of them include women. One good friend of mine is mixed race. She's done phenomenally well at a large international law firm, and I have to say, they are amongst some of the most gifted people I've ever met. That they are special. They put in an incredible amount of effort. They've got huge brains. They have been prepared to make certain sacrifices, particularly early on in their professional career, around the hours they're prepared to work, the effort they're prepared to put in, that I'm not sure I could have kept up with. So, I mean, what do you say to those people who, I mean, in my view, they're on merit?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. I am not saying that the people at the top of these organisations are not often extraordinarily talented, very hardworking, or that's not my point at all. I would say if we take a kind of very crude figure, the one I started with a while ago, 50% of partners at leading law firms, white, male and middle class. Now, if we accept that these organisations are total meritocracies, then we would have to also accept that white middle class men are in some sense better in every way than the other people that they're competing against. I don't necessarily accept that for a variety of reasons. One of the big issues in this debate is how we define and how we measure talent and what we mean by merit. And that's a really, really big question. But in theory, merit is based on, as I said, this kind of equation between hard work, exceptional talent equals success. And the idea is that that can be quite objectively measured. That would be quite technical, right? Now, in reality, within these organisations, and again, this is extraordinarily complicated because there's a lot of reasons why this happens, but within these organisations, there is no way of measuring talent or merit in an objective sense. So if we think about corporate law, for example, it's massively based on relationships, on who you know, how you get on with people. That's fairly subjective in lots of ways. It isn't really an objective characteristic, but it's incredibly important in terms of who actually gets to the very top of these organisations. And if we look at intersections, for example, what we tend to see, and again, I'm massively simplifying here for ease and swiftness, but what often happens is that people from diverse backgrounds, maybe women, perhaps people who are ethnically diverse, particularly in accountancy firms, actually, this is interesting, do pretty well up to senior manager level and may even outperform and have a faster speed of career progression than their white male peers. But what tends to happen is those white male peers leapfrog over them into the partnership. And one of the reasons is that up until kind of senior manager level, what you know is most important. And that's really technical, that's relatively meritocratic. But once you get into the very most senior levels, it's things like who you know, how you present, the way in which you are seen as trustworthy or not, the way in which you convey authority. All those kinds of things can benefit the most traditional incumbents of these jobs, which mean that at that crucial kind of transition period, they are on average more likely to get ahead. So it's not to suggest that they lack talent. I mean, it slightly depends on how you divide. And it's not that other groups who don't fit those demographics don't either. They all do. They may probably be exceptionally talented to have got that far. But it's more that we're saying, or I'm saying, that talent isn't enough. On the hard work thing and the sacrifice, I think that's really interesting because in the city, as elsewhere, there is a very long hours culture.
Yeah.
Long hours is absolutely embedded in the culture of the city and elsewhere. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of which has become part of the culture. It was very much introduced in the 80s by the Americans particularly. And it kind of became a way of differentiating and justifying the exceptional rewards enjoyed by the city. Yeah, we earn an awful lot, but we work longer hours, we work harder than anybody else. We make those sacrifices, therefore we deserve that amount of money. Now, of course, that tends to forget that lots of other people who get paid a lot less work similarly hard, but it does help to kind of justify that self-image. And what I would argue, in a sense, is that within a lot of these organisations, there's quite a lot of talented people. There's a lot of people who can technically do the work, but you need to find a way to differentiate between the people who you're going to promote to the very highest level. So you need to find ways to differentiate, literally to kind of make distinctions between different people. And I would argue that one of those ways is this kind of notion of commitment, this notion of hard work as a form of differentiator, when firms don't have that many other ways of differentiating. They have some, of course. And therefore, this notion of sacrifice becomes built in to what it takes to get ahead. We could define that as talent or merit if we want, but it's not particularly objective in the sense that kind of very purist definitions of merit would suggest. And it also has, as you can imagine, quite important implications for D&I, particularly around kind of gender-based inequalities, I guess.
Yeah, there's a couple of things you've said there which really resonate with me. This issue of the culture of it's who you know. I don't think that's just the bigger corporate law firms, you know, Louise. It's something that I see in the tech space. It's something I see in smaller law firms, and I can see how it is the cause of some imbalance. I mean, just by way of example, I'm not a big fan of going to legal awards evenings or networking at night, just because I like being at home. I like being with my family. But it's often occurred to me that, midnight finishes, travel back to a hotel in the early hours, boozy dance floors. You think about, about a woman who maybe isn't comfortable in those scenarios, about maybe folks who are Muslim who aren't used to being around alcohol or the behaviors, no matter how credible those behaviors are, or people just having fun. It's just not what they're used to culturally. I can see how that sort of unconscious development of the culture. I'm not saying anyone holds awards evenings to exclude anyone, but that sort of unconscious development of how things work, I do think that could be a barrier to entry for that networking and relationship building element that is important in you getting on, I think, in business and in law.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, I think we can't deny that social relationships will always be a really important part of work and working life and social life. I mean, that's just being human, isn't it? So I think one of the things that a lot of organisations have tried to do is we can think about what happens in the formal organisation and what happens in the so-called informal organisation. When we try to implement meritocracy, we try to formalise the informal. We try to get kind of processes and practices out of informal and make them formalised, because that's a more bureaucratic way to do things, and that bureaucracy is more associated with meritocracy. In theory, it should make kind of these decisions more based on objective and technical factors. For the most part, that hasn't really worked because it's almost impossible to do. You just cannot formalise every single interaction that happens within organisations or between organisations. And therefore, we really struggle with that. Now, I kind of argue that we need to keep working on that where and as we can, and realise that this is an issue for particular groups of people, absolutely. But my argument is partly that we will never make these organisations entirely meritocratic. It is simply impossible. Now, if we agree on that, we then have to look at how their particular rewards and the distribution of those rewards is made, how it's justified, how it's done. I would argue you can't use meritocracy as your justification, and therefore the distribution of those rewards is probably unjustifiable. We cannot do it, and we need to think about how we so much more radically about this whole kind of system and structure, basically. And so I lean towards the quality of outcome versus the quality of opportunity. So in a sense, my argument leads me to, sounds a bit pretentious, doesn't it, to say there's bigger questions, but some of those sort of wider questions, if you like.
Yeah, and I guess one of them would be what sort of a system we have, whether it's a capitalist system, which we certainly have now, or whether it's a fairer form of capitalism. But let me just, I mean, you've made some really important things there about things that are happening in our society, which law firms, in fairness to them, have very little, well, it could be argued, they have very little control over. So, for example, if I'm senior partner of a big corporate law firm in London, I've got the next batch of CVs coming through, either for trainee intake or for partnership progression. If it's right that there are inequalities and unfairness and cultural challenges baked into the system, well, what hope have I got, a senior partner of a corporate law firm who might only meet some of these applicants for the first time when they're in their mid-20s or a lot later? Isn't the damage done by then? So don't we need to be careful not to give these big corporate law firms too much of a beating?
Yeah, and actually, I think people who maybe read a synopsis of my book would be surprised to know that I actually agree with that. So one of the things I try to do in the book is explain how it is that practices that can be unfair and also potentially quite dysfunctional in relation to talent get locked in to organisations through no conscious intent or will, because organisations are part of wider systems and structures which are kind of overlap with other systems and structures. And what that means is that leaders within organisations, managers within organisations often have quite limited discretion in terms of what they can actually do. And a really simple idea or simple example is the culture of long hours. So, for example, within leading law firms, or we could talk about other organisations, that culture of long hours has become locked in. Even if organisational leaders wanted to change it, they may well really struggle to do so because they're in competition with other organisations. And so unless all of their competitors change their systems and structures at the same time, they may feel that they will lose competitive advantage if they do on their own, for example. So it's really difficult to be a particular example of an organisation that does things very differently from your competitors and your peers. Again, if you think of corporate law, there's an issue about kind of profit per equity partners. So that has become a form of kind of symbolic capital, if you like. So how much PEP you make for corporate law firms has become a kind of indicative of status, of power. Now, if you reduced your leverage ratios, if you changed that culture of long hours, there is a risk that you could undermine your PEP. And that would be problematic perhaps for partners, but also because it would make you look like a lower status firm. And these are powerful disincentives towards change that are really locked into these systems and structures. But one of the key points that I make there is that then we need to think about these systems and structures much harder. And what's happened to D&I over the last 10, 20 years is rather than looking at those really difficult issues, it tends to individualize and psychologize the problem of inequality. It makes it about things like unconscious bias or people recruiting in their own image. And that's part of the equation, it's part of the puzzle, but it doesn't really go far enough. And so we need to kind of look at and understand both. But the final point, and I promise I'll stop talking on this in a minute, is there has also been this kind of conceit within D&I agendas that the market will address and sort out these inequalities and unfairnesses. So the idea is that the market drives equalities and the market drives efficiencies. And that's actually bedded into the business case argument for change, for example. And it rests on a complete fallacy. The market doesn't drive equality and it isn't always efficient. And that's a really important point when we try to understand why diversity and inclusion perhaps hasn't been as effective as some of us might have hoped.